With massive layoffs in nearly every sector, weakness in manufacturing, car sales and housing, and the biggest one-month decline in the trade deficit since the financial crisis, the economic picture is not looking good, which might explain why so many billionaires are loading up on gold, including hedge fund manager John Paulson and real estate mogul Sam Zell. Bottom line, now is the time to own gold, which is why the experts at Stansberry Research just stepped forward with a major gold prediction, arguing gold could soar as high as $3,000 by the end of the year, possibly even higher. You can find out why and get instant access to their #1 gold investment today. It's not bullion, an ETF, or a mining stock, but in the past, this gold strategy could have made you nearly 50x your money. Considering how quickly the price of gold has been moving in recent weeks, you don't want to waste any time missing out on the gains these experts believe are in store for this gold stock. To get a copy of his new free report with all the details, simply go to goldmaniareport.com. Again, that's goldmaniareport.com for a free copy of his new report. Hi, this is Daniela Cambone, and welcome back to the Daniela Cambone Show. Well, my next guest has said that the enemy of the US dollar is not China, it's not Russia, it's not Saudi Arabia, it's not Iran, it's actually the US Congress. We're going to get his thoughts on de-dollarization and more. Please welcome back to the show, Rick Rule of Rule Investment Media. Rick, it's been too long. I know you've been a globetrotter. Thank you for making time for me today.
Daniela, I look forward to our conversations. Thank you in turn for having me back.
Well, I know you've been up to some pretty cool travels, and we're going to talk about that at the tail end of the interview. I thought we'd start with this nice light topic of de-dollarization, because since we last spoke, let me just go over a few important headlines here. The Indian rupee has been making great strides, with now 18 countries being allowed to trade in Indian currency and give up dollar as cross-border transaction mode. There's obviously buzz around the petro yuan. In fact, China has been increasingly pushing the yuan as a currency for oil deals, challenging the dollar's lead in commodity markets. And of course, we have Russia encouraging its BRIC nation friends to develop a currency together outside of the US dollar. And I bring this up because 2 months ago, you were already warning about this. You weren't saying, hey, the dollar's going to die tomorrow, but warning that there are nations, rogue nations, looking for solutions outside of the dollar. So do any of these developments surprise you?
They don't. And I think from a global context, we need to identify the U.S. as a rogue nation, since we're starting lightly. And I'll go into that. I need to preface this by saying that I don't expect in the near or intermediate term any of these efforts will be successful in dislodging the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. We have, for all of our faults, which we'll get into later, the most liquid and the most transparent currency and security markets in the world. Our currency is freely convertible. Our finances, while bad, are described well. So we have lots of transparency. If you compare us with the competitors, Doug Casey famously described the U.S. dollar as an I owe you nothing, and he described the euro as a who owes you nothing.
That's right.
If the euro is a who owes you nothing, what would the BRICS nations be? Look at the financial transparency or the convertibility of currencies from, as an example, Brazil or Russia or India or South Africa. So I need to say at the outset that the efforts to replace the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency will not bear fruit for a while. But let's look at the allegation by myself and others that the worst enemy of the U.S. dollar, rather than being external, is from within. In the first instance, we are doing our very best to wreck the value proposition around U.S. Treasury securities. We're doing that because we're profligate issuers. We owe, on a recourse basis, $32 trillion to ourselves and other people. And by the way, off balance sheet through Medicare and Medicaid, another $100 trillion. $130 trillion in debt, and we promise to service this with a budget that's in deficit $2 trillion a year. You don't dig yourself out of a hole by digging deeper, which is precisely what we're doing. But Daniela, from an investor's point of view, a foreign investor's point of view, it gets worse. The value proposition is arithmetically unsound. We are proposing to pay U.S. dollar borrowers of U.S. Treasury securities 3.4% in a currency that we acknowledge, we, meaning the Congressional Budget Office, acknowledge is depreciating in terms of purchasing power by 7% a year. In other words, we solemnly swear to cost the buyers of U.S. 10-year treasuries 3.5% of their purchasing power a year for 10 years. No wonder foreign buyers don't want to subject themselves to a certificate of guaranteed confiscation, which arithmetically is what the U.S. 10-year treasury is. But it gets worse. We've weaponized the dollar. We have used the dollar's franchise. When I say we, I say it advisedly. Our Congress has weaponized the dollar. We have weaponized the SWIFT banking system. We have unilaterally imposed sanctions in an effort to extraterritorially impose our value and our politics on others. We may believe that our political system and our values are superior to other countries, but the countries that we're trying to impose them on obviously feel differently. And they feel, from their own point of view, that they have no alternative but to sell U.S. treasuries and look to buy and sell goods and services from other non-U.S. countries in mediums of exchange where the U.S. can't unilaterally interfere. So I would suggest to you that the enemies of the U.S. dollar are not Saudi Arabia. They aren't China. They aren't Russia. I mean, the Russian economy is, a gas station tied to an army. It's really inconsequential compared to the U.S. The damage being done to the U.S. dollar, the damage being done to the U.S. franchise comes out of Washington, D.C., and American citizens have benefited mightily from what de Gaulle called the exorbitant privilege of being the issuer of the world's reserve currency. All American citizens, all American taxpayers need to be concerned about the idiocy of the programs which seem inadvertently to be geared to the demise of the U.S. dollar.
Rick, and that's an incredible point, and I'm glad you brought up that Doug Casey quote, because he said it, during a time when there was fear that the euro would overtake the dollar. So this is not the first time in history that we're talking about de-dollarization. And in fact, I just had Kevin O'Leary on, and I wanted to share this quote to get your thoughts. He absolutely doesn't think the dollar's dying anytime soon. In fact, he said he's been hearing this every 2 years since 1966. He says,
you only have to ask yourself one question. If you're a sovereign wealth fund, I don't care what country, Middle East country, Eastern, Western Europe, where is the majority of your wealth right now? It's sitting in the S&P 500, denominated in the US dollar. Now, until that changes, there's no chance of another currency becoming the default currency of the world.
He goes on to say,
what country says it's dumping their US dollar? Cuba, Venezuela, Brazil? Who cares?
So your thoughts on his statement there? I mean, is it flippant to just be saying, well, those countries don't count? Who cares?
I think Mr. O'Leary may be unnecessarily equity interested. The bond market is much larger than the equity market. And the truth is that the bond market globally, including the sovereign bond market, is mostly U.S. dollar denominated. Demand for dollars will continue as long as countries want to borrow money less expensively in a currency other than their own, and in particular, as long as those other countries need to pay interest on their debt, which is, of course, denominated in U.S. dollars. For all of our faults, the U.S. is still 23% of the world's global savings and investment assets. It's the largest, most liquid, most transparent market in the world. And I suspect that what Mr. O'Leary says is correct, although I suspect it's correct probably for other reasons. One other Doug Casey quote, which is, the dollar benefits by being, quote, the prettiest mare at the slaughterhouse.
Exactly. And well, I guess bigger picture, if we're on the subject of BRICS, this is the other topic I wanted to bring up. is that, while we're all sleeping, the BRICS now contribute 31.5% of global GDP, while the G7 share has fallen to 30%. The BRICS are expected to contribute over 50% of global GDP by 2030. Your thoughts on the growing power and strength of the BRICS here, Rick? I mean,
I think it's a wonderful thing for. I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, what is the U.S. thinking when they're looking at these figures?
Well, hopefully, what the U.S. is thinking is that this is a wonderful thing. The BRICS represent 40% of the population of humankind? Wouldn't it be wonderful if the BRICS nations continued to raise the living standards of the poor worldwide? What American, as an example, when we look at 1 billion people globally who have no access to electricity, what American would want to deny 1 billion people on Earth access to electricity? What American, what good-thinking American, would want to consign the billion poorest people on Earth to perpetual poverty? What American could actually resent the success that the Chinese have enjoyed, raising the living standards of almost 1 billion people in 30 years? So the increase in material well-being in BRICS nations is something that any American with an ounce of moral fiber would favor. In terms of the degradation of U.S. power, I would argue with you that that wound is self-inflicted. The thing that made the United States the reserve currency in the world and the largest economy of the world was individual liberty and freedom. It was the fact that for all our faults, as we've described before, Daniela, 6 pimply-faced kids can commandeer a garage in Sunnyvale, California, and out pops Apple or out pops Google, replicated all the way down to much smaller enterprises. It's American enterprise that built the real power that the U.S. enjoys. And to the extent that the U.S. wants to remain the preeminent economic power in the world, the idea that we focus on our own shop, the idea that we should cure what ails our own country economically, the idea that we dispel envy in search of prosperity, if we were able to do that, 2 things would happen. The pressure on foreign countries to defend themselves from the weaponization of the U.S. dollar would disappear because we weren't weaponizing it. At the same time that we still have the ability, the financial ability, the educational ability, the social ability, to restore the U.S. economy to prosperity simply by focusing on the things that made American great, which is to say individual liberty. To the extent that we don't do that, to the extent that we try to compete with totalitarian regimes who are much more efficient at the oppression of their citizenry, probably will finish in second place. Why would we choose to do that?
A very good question, Rick. So let's bring it back and talk about the American economy, because the last time you were on, you were actually surprised by the strength that we were seeing in the economy. Now we're speaking ahead of a very important Fed meeting, but I also wanted to bring this up. A record 69% of the American public now holds negative views about the economy, both now and in the future. This is according to CNBC All-American Economic Survey. It also has Joe Biden's approval rating falling by 2 percentage points to 39%, and his disapproval rating rising by a point to 55% compared with the November survey. But let's focus on the economy. I mean, are you still feeling good? I mean, yeah, we had good CPI. We're fighting the inflation fight. It's working. What are your thoughts today, though?
I'm afraid, but I continue to be amazed by the strength of the U.S. economy, U.S. equity markets, even U.S. debt markets, in the face of a 100% rise in interest rates. I understand, I guess, that the impact of this rise in interest rates lags, and that we probably haven't seen the worst results of the increase in the cost of capital and the cost of credit across the economy. But I think it's a real testimony to the fundamental and underlying strength of the American culture and the American economy that we have taken the shocks to the system afforded by higher interest rates, admittedly negative real interest rates, but higher nominal interest rates, and the incredible increase in our aggregate indebtedness, which is to say the government debt, and the incredible self-imposition of the idiotic regulatory regime that we've subjected itself to. It's as though the U.S. economy was, if you will, a prize fighter that could take every possible punch thrown at him or her and continue to move forward simply because of their own strength. I'm in a small community in northwestern Washington with such a severe labor shortage that young people with no training whatsoever get paid $20 an hour to start at Safeway to learn how to be a checker. This is not, at least in the near term, what I would describe as a weak economy. I understand that I probably live in a bright spot in the U.S. economy. But if you had told me 20 months ago that jobs, that investment, that equity markets, that debt prices, debt markets could hold up in the face of a doubling of the nominal interest rate and also an increasing lack of availability of credit throughout the economy, I would have said you were crazy. And I have been wrong, and I'm delighted to be wrong. I'm still afraid that the impact of government debt, of rising real interest rates and regulation will lag, and that we'll get pounded in the future. But I need to say I'm delighted that I haven't had to bear the pain yet.
Well, hold on. You've been right on the money when it comes to what the Fed, what their next steps were. And I want to get to that. But now that we're just talking jobs, a thought came to mind. I'm just curious to get your thoughts. If you were to advise, a youngster who's looking at fields to enter, where do you think the strength lies? I mean, 10 years ago, it was definitely tech and engineering, but today, not so much. I mean, where do you think the greatest prosperity lies? Mining? Apart from mining.
I believe that I believe, and I've been fortunate enough to mentor thousands of young people online. I believe the most important thing that a young person can do is to invest in their own education and training. When people say follow your passion, it seems too simple, but follow your passion. If you understand how to do something, particularly if you like doing it, you will do it better than competitors. If you do it better than competitors, you will generate more utility for your employer, and your employer will be forced to, if nothing else, pay you better. The field that you enter, I think, really should be a field that you are so interested in that, like me, it doesn't feel like work. You would do it for free if it didn't pay so well. In that circumstance, your customer will benefit, your employer will benefit. Hopefully, if you're an entrepreneur, you'll actually be able to own your own future at some point in time. That's what made America great, and that's what can make every individual great. I am not one who would say to an extremely smart, extremely hardworking person who is good at math and sciences that the game around technology is over. Right. I don't think it's anywhere close to over. I just think that the promise around technology got so overhyped that access to capital in technology has returned to market rates. It is arguable, Daniela, that for 30 years, if you compare the market capitalization of technology companies to the net present value of cash they generate, it's arguable that their cost of capital was sub-zero, which is to say the investor's expectation of the future was so great that the industry was hopelessly overcapitalized. We're coming into an epoch now where technology companies have to compete with other companies. It feels to the technology companies like a bear market. All it is a return to reality. And so young people who are able to educate themselves well enough that they can help solve some of the biggest problems in the world through technology will continue to enjoy careers that are intellectually rewarding but financially rewarding as well. I'm not telling all of your young people to go into technology. I, as an example, am celebrating my retirement at age 70 by starting a new bank. I think that banking is a wonderful business, if you like it. What I can say to people is Invest in yourself.
Yeah.
Educate yourself first. Do something where you can't wait to get up in the morning to go to work and where you resent having to go home at night because you aren't working anymore. In that fashion, whatever it is, you'll do well.
And I do want to talk banking, but yes, I think we are fortunate, both of us, Rick, that, we did find our passions and we don't feel like we're working. I think it's, easier said than done. A lot of folks will come up to me and say, well, how do I even know what my passion is, right? And I know this is a conversation in itself. But yes, I think you are one of the lucky ones out there.
Daniela, I remember you starting out as a young pup reporter. One of the things that set you apart from others is that you had taken the time to listen to my prior interviews and read my stuff. I have always admired you for that. If you really follow your passion, you simply outcompete the people that you compete with, which you've done through your whole career.
Well, thank you. I mean, I was practicing it in front of my mirror when I was, 5 years old to be a journalist. So yeah, that's why I do consider myself one of the lucky ones. But let's move on. Let's talk the Fed. I said you were right on track because you were always in the camp saying the Fed's doing what it has to do. It should be raising interest rates. You said the last time you thought it was going to be 25 basis points. Indeed, it was. Now we're speaking ahead of a critical one where a lot of experts are coming on saying the Fed must absolutely pause. Thoughts?
Well, I think what the Fed should do is get out of the way. I think the Fed should let markets set interest rates. The idea that a bunch of big thinkers, a bunch of policy wonks, be they Trump, be they Biden, be they George Soros, I would prefer that they shriveled up and got jobs somewhere productive rather than at the Fed. But as what's going to happen, I think that the Fed is genuinely concerned, as they should be, about very stubborn core and non-core inflation. And I think that there is enough room in the U.S. economy, perhaps not in the housing market, but in the U.S. economy, I think there's enough room that they can raise interest rates and they should raise interest rates.
Okay.
Absolutely. I believe that an artificially low interest rate is the political manifestation of a war against savers by spenders. A nation doesn't get wealthier by increasing spending. It gets wealthier by increasing savings. And the idea that savings products in the United States, as a consequence of the interference of the Fed, have negative real yields, which is to say the yield on savings products is less than the rate of inflation, is an unnatural phenomenon. I do believe that the Fed stands some outside chance of engineering a soft landing. I don't think it'll happen, but if higher interest rates are able to moderate the economy enough that inflation falls below the nominal yields on things like the U.S. 10-year Treasury, then the Fed will have made a mighty achievement. Believe me, Daniela, I don't think that'll be the case, but I think there's a possibility that they would be successful.
Well, you brought up a bank, and yes, you have come back full force with the launch of a bank. And I'm going to ask you, why in the world would you enter the banking sector now? Now, I know you're doing something different, but a lot of people thought, given the banking crisis and given the if you want to call it winning on the inflation front, that the Fed would say, okay, it looks like we have things under control here, that we can afford to pause.
And perhaps they can. I would do what I'm doing today, starting a new bank, irrespective of what the Fed does. I pay about as much attention to the Fed, except for that they're one of my regulators. But I pay about as much attention to Fed policy as Warren Buffett does, which is to say, not very much. I'm getting back into the banking business because big groups of savers and borrowers, groups that I have personal familiarity with, are underserved by the U.S. banking industry. There are many brilliant people in the banking industry, people who are hardworking, people who normally could compete with me, but they've taken leave of their senses. they don't seem to be blocking and tackling anymore. The fact that banks in the United States have such tremendous mismatch in duration between their own borrowings, their depositors, and their lending, the thing that brought down Silicon Valley Bank, is astonishing to me. This isn't being a genius. This is just blocking and tackling around bankers. The fact that many American banks pay no interest on deposits, particularly savings deposits. This is truly an insanity. At Everbank, our last bank, we had one deposit product. It could be a savings account, it could be a checking account, it could be whatever you wanted. And we made a commitment to our depositors that we would be in the top quartile of deposit interest payers nationally. That doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what the Fed does. If you treat your customer well, you will own the customer. Similarly, the big banks around the country are de-emphasizing oil and gas lending. This is truly idiocy.
Right.
I never imagined in my wildest dreams, Daniela, that I would be able to compete with the biggest banks in the country in energy lending, which is the business I started off in. But I can compete with them if they don't show up to compete with me. It didn't occur to me that the big banks in the country wouldn't consider physical gold and silver held in segregated accounts to be a reliable asset class to lend against. So I'm getting back in the banking business simply because the banking business has forgot who and what their customers are.
And I'd be fascinated to get in the mind of Rick Rule during the unfolding of all this crisis. You've started a bank. Did it change anything for you? I mean, obviously it didn't deter you, but did it give you more insights of, okay, we have to be better protected here? I mean, did it change anything in your mindset as the banks were burning? Did it change anything for you?
Well, it made me really excited. What it means is that there's a whole bunch of customers that aren't being served by their existing institutions. And if I serve those customers right, I can grab them. Daniela, I can't compete with Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase or Wells Fargo or Citicorp, and they can't compete with me either. There is a sector of the American market which is perpetually underserved. And to the extent that we had dislocation and disintermediation in the banking business, to the extent that there was turmoil, what that really meant to me is that there were some really good bankers that I could hire. There's some really good depositors that I could take. There's some great borrowers out there that I could service. There has never been a better time to enter an industry than when the industry is in flux, in crisis, particularly if you have a lot of experience in that industry, and particularly if, like me, your Rolodex, if that's the right word, is very deep with bankers, depositors, and borrowers.
Yeah, I mean, I feel your competitor spirit from here, Rick. You're like the Tom Brady of our industry. You just can't retire. It's just not part of your DNA. Now, luckily, you have a very supportive spouse who encourages, I am sure, Bonnie encourages all of this. So that's where you're definitely better off than Tom was. But yeah, I mean, I wish you, tons of luck, and I'm sure you'll have no shortage of success with it. Just final thoughts, Rick, for all our viewers. I mean, we covered a lot of ground here. Like I've said in multiple interviews, folks worried about the times we're up against. Anything you're doing different, or some advice for them?
I'm not doing very much different, Daniela. I sort of found my footing as an investor when I was 29 or 30, coming off, the demise of the decade of the 70s, the last time the world really changed. The world is changing now, which I think is great. So am I doing anything differently? No. I'm paying attention to my strengths. I'm avoiding my own weaknesses. I'm deeply involved, as you know, in investor education. I'd like to talk to your audience about that.
Please.
As before, any of your audience that wants to have a conversation with me about natural resources can simply email their natural resource portfolio to ruleinvestmentmedia.com, and I'll rank that portfolio personally, no obligation, for free. In addition, as you know, Daniela, I'm involved in a lot of investor education projects, one of which is our upcoming Boca Raton Natural Resources Investment Seminar Symposium, where I believe that you will be, and where your publisher, Stansberry, will be an executive sponsor. This is, I believe, the 30th annual in that series, focused around natural resources, 48 hours of programming in 4 days, the best of the big picture thinkers, not the ones that you would see on CNBC, but rather the ones where you would have to go to Daniela Camboni to see them, the Jim Rickards of the world, the Bill Bonners of the world, the Grant Williams of the world. Importantly, after that, the best analysts, the best portfolio managers that you can see in the natural resource-based businesses to tell you how they invest and what you should invest in. But much more importantly than that, 5 or 6 living legends who have built multi-billion-dollar companies from scratch talk about the process and the lessons that they learned and how those lessons can make you a better investor. And the guarantee from me, like every investment education product I've ever had in my life, if your listeners pay the tuition fee and come to Boca Raton to see us and don't think they got their money's worth, I will refund their money. No questions asked. Money back guarantee. And by the way, if you can't come to Boca Raton, for the first time in 30 years, the Boca Raton conference will be live cast.
There you go.
So that you can see it in whatever country you live in. One more time, if you don't think you got your money's worth from the live cast, absolutely, we'll refund your.
I can't wrap just yet. You brought up Jim Rickards, and I know I'm going to get all this in the comments section if I don't bring this up. He actually just wrote a really great article. I encourage everyone to write. We'll fire it up on the screen here about why gold. Yes, we cracked through 2000, but why isn't it higher? Why isn't it easily holding 2000 and higher? Right. So I encourage everyone to read it. He explains it in detail as to why. So, like I said, it's been over 2 months since we spoke. Gold's had a great rally here. Your thoughts on gold, and is it where it should be, or overall, where should it be, I guess, is the question.
Well, I think gold goes not merely higher, but substantially higher. I think most investors' timeframes are fictional. Will this occur by the next long weekend? Probably not, Daniela. Our response to gold has been shaped by 40 years of benign economic climate with lower real interest rates, negative real interest rates, frankly, and moderated inflation. I suggest that 40 years is over. Gold does well when people, as we've discussed before, are concerned about the maintenance of their purchasing power and other savings and investment assets. And people should be very concerned. I consider the quote in US dollar terms to be a floating abstraction, because despite the fact that it's the worldwide medium of exchange, the US dollar is a floating abstraction. I also note that against most currencies, gold is already in record territory. I think that if your listeners believe that we will return to real interest rates, which is to say that inflation will subside below the rate paid on the U.S. 10-year Treasury, that they don't need to own gold. I suspect that if your listeners believe what Justin Trudeau said, which is the budget will balance itself, that they don't need to own gold. I suggest that if your listeners believe that $32 trillion in on-balance sheet liabilities and $100 trillion in off-balance sheet liabilities being serviced by a budget and deficit as to $2 trillion a year is something that they don't need to be concerned about, they shouldn't own gold. I don't share a lack of concern about any of that. I think inflation is a problem. I think negative real interest rates, particularly as a saver, is a problem. I think the debt is a problem. I think the deficit is obscene. The consequence of that is that I own physical gold, a fair amount of it. I also own as investments big gold mining companies and as speculations little gold mining companies. I would prefer, Daniela, to look back at today, 10 years from now, and say all of that insurance, all of the gold I bought was for naught. Everything had a happy ending. Congress balanced the budget. Inflation came down of its own volition. The debt somehow magically got paid off. I don't believe in magic, so I own gold, and I think that your listeners should too.
Final thought, central bank digital currencies. I know we can't just sum it up in 5 minutes, but I just want to highlight from the IMF spring meeting, the emergence of this global unicoin now. Are people overhyping it for nothing or not? That's kind of where I want to get your thoughts. But we are, definitely headed in the direction of CBDCs. We see the Fed Now program going to be launched in July. As a payment service system, we see China ramping up their efforts in terms of rolling out the CBDC fully. So I guess the question is, are you surprised that all this is really rolling out at lightning speed, or is this what you were expecting?
It's my worst nightmare, Daniela. The idea that with, in particular, artificial intelligence, governments can do what the Chinese are doing now, which is to assign a credit score, a social credit score, to their citizenry, and then control that citizenry's money by not having them have cash, but rather have a digital currency that the government can cancel at will. This is the worst possible nightmare. Can you imagine a world where Hitler or Mao or Stalin had access to this type of power with this type of convergent technology? Well, I wouldn't equate either Trump or Biden necessarily with Hitler or Stalin or Mao. I certainly don't want Biden or Trump or whoever the next person to accede to the presidency of the United States to have that measure of control over my life, their ability to monitor what I think, say, and do through artificial intelligence. The ability then to assign me a credit score based on my political correctness, and the ability, if they so choose, to cancel my savings, cancel my money, really is the worst of all possible scenarios.
Well, a few things there, and I don't want to stop you. Can't your money already be canceled in an existing banking system if wanted? And two, what do you say to the people who are saying, well, Rick, when's the last time you paid anything in cash? I mean, we're already using credit cards, debit cards. They're already tracking everything. We have Alexa in our house spying on us, Google. They already know everything you're doing anyways. Who cares?
I have some sympathy for that. I need to tell you, Daniela, as a consequence of the popularity of central bank digital currency, and as a function of my concern for poor people, I am using much, much, much more cash in day-to-day transactions.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's one thing that I personally can do. In particular now, when I go to restaurants, I often pay cash. And what I do, Daniela, as a consciousness-raising exercise is I call the waiter or waitress over, and I say, this which I'm giving you is not a tip. The IRS suggests that a tip is taxable. This is a gift. I am giving this to you.
Yes.
And my interpretation and the IRS's interpretation is that a gift up to $17,000 per recipient is non-taxable. Please understand that this cash, which I am giving you, is, in the eyes of the giver, not a gift, which is taxable, but a tip, which is non-taxable. Why should a young person starting out in a service business, which I did, by the way, I was a waiter in my youth, why should that person have to give up 35 or 40% of the consideration that I give them for their service to a government which does its very best to oppress them?
That's right.
So I'm, in fact, using more and more cash in my day-to-day transactions, and I'm trying in my day-to-day transactions to educate people about the faults in the system that we exist in.
I am so happy you shared that, because here's something so small that all of us can and should be doing. Yes, I know a lot of us are even lazy to go to the ATM to withdraw the cash, but you're right. That is absolutely something that we should all be doing, Rick. And I thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think that to your point of this is, a nightmare situation rolling out. I mean, it's just unstoppable at this point, is it not?
I'm not sure it's unstoppable. I think that there are other measures that the government can take to oppress us, which are less overt. My customers for years have been saying, is the government going to steal my IRA? I say no, they're going to increase regulation, they're going to increase taxation, and in particular, they're going to increase quantitative easing, which is to say counterfeiting. And all of those things make them popular. If they come to overtly steal your IRA, you may violently resist. This is probably going to obviate the rest of the interview. I'm frankly delighted that there are 400 million guns in private circulation in the United States. I don't think that we'll ever have to use them simply as a consequence of the fact that we have so many. It is easier for the government to steal from us in a fashion like quantitative easing. By the way, sidebar, as I understand it, the U.S. government put in excess of $200 billion into the banking system very recently. They didn't borrow it. They didn't increase tax. They conjured up that $200 billion from thin air. This is counterfeiting. And it's made the government not exceptionally, but it's made them much more popular than they otherwise would have been. Many Americans believe that their government is protecting them from the ills of the banking system. Ills, of course, that the government caused. My point is simply that there are ways of implementing the policies of the big thinkers that are less confrontational than overt theft, like covert theft, like Mr. Biden's plan to steal more from those who he identifies as the rich, or Governor Newsom's plan to loot the oil companies. These are policy goals that make government popular. And my hope is that government dries up and blows away, but let's constrain ourselves. My belief is that the government may elect to confine themselves to stealing from us in indirect fashion rather than in direct fashion, because it presents less risk to them. At least that's my hope.
This is just getting so good. We're going to have Rick Rule back. Thank you so much, Rick. And I guess I invite all my listeners in honor of Rick, going out this weekend, have dinner, and tip the server in cash. Please, we can all make a difference.
And tell them that it's a gift and non-taxable.
There you go. Let's all do this. I am going to do that. Rick, I can't wait to see you. I love having you on. What more can I say? You got to come back, okay? You got to come back sooner.
Well, Daniela, thank you, and thank you. I would consider it an honor to be your guest anytime. I really look forward to seeing you in Boca Raton and listening to your presentation.
Awesome.
And also breaking bread. And I promise I'll tip in cash.
There you go. Rick Rule, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you for watching this edition of the Daniela Camboni Show. We'll have more great content coming your way, so be sure to stay tuned to the Daniela Camboni Show and sign up at danielacamboni.com. That's it for me. Thanks for watching.
Opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the contributor and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Stansberry Research, its parent company, or affiliates.